The weight of quiet truths. The road into Ashwood curved the way memory does. Never quite straight, never entirely honest. Claire slowed her car as the trees began to close in, their branches arching overhead like an old cathedral ceiling. October had painted everything in burnished gold and rust, and the late afternoon light filtered through the leaves in a way that made time feel thinner, as though the years between then and now could be folded back with a careful hand. She cracked the window. The air smelled of wood smoke and something faintly sweet, damp leaves perhaps, or the last apples clinging to unseen branches. It was a scent she hadn't realized she'd missed until it reached her again. The town sign appeared almost without warning.
Ashwood, 1812.
The paint was chipped, but someone had recently traced the lettering with care. That felt right. Ashwood had always been a place that preserved things, sometimes too well. Claire drove past the familiar stretch of Main Street. The diner still stood at the corner, its windows glowing amber against the cooling light. A bell chimed faintly as someone stepped out, and the sound carried on the breeze, soft and steady. For a moment she thought of stopping. Coffee had a way of anchoring a person. But not yet. Not before the house. Her hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel as she turned onto Maple Lane. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and deeply grooved, like the hands of someone who had worked too long without rest. Leaves skittered across the road, dry and restless, whispering against the tires. The house came into view slowly, as if reluctant to reveal itself. It looked smaller than she remembered. The porch sagged just a little on the left side. The white paint had faded to a tired cream, and the shutters hung unevenly, as though they had been mid-thought when someone stopped caring. Still, the structure held. It always had. Claire parked and sat for a moment, engine off, hands resting in her lap. The silence was not empty. It was layered, wind brushing through branches, a distant screen door slamming somewhere down the street, the faint ticking of the car cooling beneath her. It felt expectant. "You came back," she murmured to herself, though it wasn't clear whether she meant the town or her own reflection in the windshield. When she stepped out, the cold air wrapped around her ankles first, then climbed upward, settling into her coat. The gravel shifted underfoot in a way she remembered from childhood. A small grounding crunch that seemed to say, yes, this is real. The key was where it had always been. Beneath the third flower pot, chipped along the rim. Claire paused before lifting it. 40 years had a way of changing what a person believed about permanence, and yet here it was, unchanged. Or perhaps untouched. She unlocked the door. It opened with a slow, deliberate creak, as though the house needed to stretch after a long sleep. The scent met her immediately. Old wood, closed rooms, and something softer beneath it all. Lavender. Her mother's doing. The floorboards answered each step with a quiet complaint. Dust hovered in the air, catching the last strands of daylight that filtered through the curtains. Everything was where it had been, and yet not. The absence was louder than any rearrangement could have been. Claire set her bag down by the door. "Well," she said softly, her voice sounding unfamiliar in the space, "we'll have to learn each other again." She moved slowly through the rooms, her fingers brushing along surfaces out of habit more than necessity. The dining table bore faint scratches she remembered tracing as a child. The bookshelf still leaned slightly to the right. In the corner of the living room, the old armchair remained, its fabric worn thin at the arms. She paused there. For a moment, she could almost see her mother sitting in it, head tilted, eyes half closed, as though listening to something no one else could hear. You never did explain everything, Claire whispered. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter against the house in an uneven rhythm. The sound echoed through the walls, not quite unsettling, but not entirely comforting either. Upstairs, the air was colder. Claire climbed slowly, her hand sliding along the banister polished smooth by years of use. The hallway felt narrower than she remembered, the doors closer together, as though time had drawn everything inward. Her old room was unchanged, save for a thin layer of dust. The quilt still lay folded at the foot of the bed. The window overlooked the backyard where the maple tree stood, its leaves now a brilliant, fleeting red. Time has a way of catching up. The phrase came unbidden, settling somewhere behind her ribs. She turned toward the smaller room at the end of the hall, her mother's room. The door resisted slightly before opening, as if holding on to its last defense. Inside, the air carried that same lavender note, though fainter now. The bed was neatly made. The dresser stood untouched. Claire approached it slowly. The top drawer slid open without protest. Inside lay the usual things, scarves, a few pieces of jewelry neatly arranged. Beneath them, however, something caught her attention. A box. Small. Wooden. Unremarkable at first glance. Except for the lock. Claire frowned. Her mother had never locked anything. Not drawers, not cabinets, not even the front door most nights. It had been a point of quiet disagreement between them. She lifted the box carefully. It was heavier than she expected, the wood cool against her palms. "Since when did you start keeping secrets?" she murmured. The wind outside softened suddenly, as if listening. Claire turned the box over in her hands. No key, no visible mechanism beyond the small, simple lock. For a moment she considered forcing it open. The thought passed just as quickly. That wasn't how this place worked. Ashwood had never been kind to force. Instead, she set the box gently on the bed. The light outside had shifted to a deeper gold, the kind that signals the end of something rather than its beginning. Shadows stretched across the room, long and quiet. Claire sat beside the box, her fingers resting lightly on its surface. There was a story here. She could feel it, not in the way of certainty but in the way of something waiting. And waiting, she suspected, had been happening for a very long time. She looked toward the window, where the last leaves trembled against the dimming sky. "Who locked it?" she whispered, almost to the room itself. "And why?" Morning came quietly, not with brightness but with a kind of softened light that seemed to hesitate at the edges of the room, as though uncertain whether it was welcome in a house that had held its breath for so long. Claire woke to the sound of something subtle, wood shifting perhaps, or the distant murmur of wind brushing against the siding, and for a moment she did not remember where she was, only that the air carried a stillness unlike anything she had known in years. Then it returned. The house. Ashwood. The past. She sat up slowly, the quilt falling away from her shoulders, and the chill of the room met her immediately, not harsh but insistent, settling into the quiet spaces she had not yet filled. Downstairs, the floor greeted her again with its familiar creaks, each step sounding slightly louder in the morning silence, as though the house itself were reminding her that she was no longer just passing through. The box remained where she had left it, centered on the table, waiting. Claire paused a few steps away, her arms folding lightly as she studied it, as though distance might offer some clarity that proximity could not. "You're just a box," she said quietly, though the words carried no conviction. She reached for it again, her fingers tracing the edges more deliberately this time, searching for some imperfection, some weakness, something that might explain why it had been hidden at all. But it offered nothing. No give. No hint. Only presence. A sound interrupted her. Not inside. Outside. A steady rhythmic tapping. Claire turned toward the front of the house, the noise becoming clearer as she moved closer. Wood against wood, measured, purposeful, unmistakable. She opened the door. The air was colder than she expected, the morning still holding on to the last of the night's chill, and the scent of damp leaves lingered faintly beneath it. On the porch stood Arthur, a hammer in one hand, a loose board at his feet, his posture steady as though he had always belonged there. "Figured I'd take care of this before it gets worse," he said, nodding toward the porch railing, where the wood had begun to split along one edge. Claire leaned slightly against the doorframe, her gaze moving from the damaged board back to him. "You always fix things before they break completely?" she asked. Arthur shrugged, the motion small but deliberate. "Sometimes it's easier that way," he said. "Sometimes it just gives you something to do." There was something in the answer that lingered longer than the words themselves. Claire stepped aside. "You might as well come in when you're done," she said, her tone casual, though it carried a quiet acknowledgement that she did not want to be alone with the house, or the box, just yet. Arthur nodded once and returned to his work, the steady rhythm of the hammer resuming, each strike measured, controlled, as though he were not just repairing wood, but maintaining something less visible. Claire remained in the doorway for a moment, watching. Then she went back inside. The box had not moved. Of course it hadn't. Still, it felt different now, as though the presence of another person, just beyond the walls, had shifted something in the way it occupied the room. When Arthur finally stepped inside, he did so without announcement, brushing his hands together lightly as though leaving the work outside where it belonged. "Should hold for a while now," he said. Claire nodded, though her attention had already returned to the table. Arthur followed her gaze. The box. He did not speak immediately, but something in his expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough to suggest recognition or perhaps memory. "That yours?" he asked. Claire hesitated. "It was my mother's," she said. Arthur stepped closer, not intrusively, but with a quiet certainty that made the movement feel inevitable rather than intentional. He studied the box for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion but in familiarity. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice lower now, more deliberate. Claire felt something shift in her chest. "In her dresser," she replied. "Locked away." Arthur's gaze did not leave the box. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, almost to himself, "Haven't seen one like this in a long time." Claire watched him carefully. "You recognize it," she said. Arthur did not answer directly. Instead, he reached out, his hand hovering just above the surface of the wood, as though unsure whether touching it would confirm something he wasn't ready to face. "Some things," he said slowly, "don't show up by accident." The room felt smaller suddenly. Not physically, but in the way silence can close in when it begins to hold more than sound. Claire straightened slightly, her voice steadier than she felt. "Then maybe it's time I know why it was hidden," she said. Arthur finally looked at her. Really looked. And whatever he saw there seemed to settle something in him. "Maybe," he said. But the word did not carry certainty. Only the sense that whatever came next had already begun long before either of them had stepped into that room. Claire glanced back at the box, her fingers resting lightly against its edge once more. And this time the question felt different. Not distant, not abstract, but immediate, personal, unavoidable. "Where did you find this?" Arthur had asked. Now it echoed back, heavier than before. Because perhaps the real question was not where it had been, but why it had waited. Morning arrived in Ashwood without urgency, unfolding slowly beneath a pale, diffused light that filtered through a thin veil of cloud, as though the sky itself were reluctant to commit fully to the day, and the air carried with it that particular stillness that comes just before the town begins to breathe again. Claire stood for a while at the window of her mother's bedroom, watching as a few remaining leaves loosened their hold and drifted downward in quiet spirals, their descent neither hurried nor hesitant, but deliberate in a way that made her think of choices long postponed rather than truly forgotten. The box remained where she had left it, resting at the center of the bed like a question that had not yet decided whether it wanted to be answered. She had slept little. Not because of discomfort, but because the house, in its layered silences and subtle sounds, the soft shift of wood adjusting to the cold, the distant hum of wind threading through unseen cracks, seemed to speak in a language she almost understood, yet could not quite translate. By late morning, she found herself drawn toward Main Street, not out of intention but something closer to instinct, as though the town itself were guiding her steps toward a place where objects held memory more openly than people did. The antique shop stood between a narrow bookstore and a closed tailor's storefront, its windows filled with a careful arrangement of items that seemed less displayed than quietly waiting, and above the door hung a small brass bell that gave a soft, measured chime as Claire stepped inside, the sound lingering just long enough to feel like acknowledgement. The interior smelled of polished wood, old paper, and something faintly floral, lavender again, though subtler here, as if it belonged more to memory than to the present moment. And the light that entered through the front windows settled gently across surfaces worn smooth by years of quiet handling. Behind the counter stood Martha, her silver hair pinned neatly as though each strand had been given its place with care, and her hands moved with a practiced calm as she polished a small porcelain figurine that already seemed impossibly clean. "You found your way in," Martha said, her voice low and measured, carrying the kind of pause that suggested she weighed each word before letting it go. Claire smiled faintly, though there was a hesitation beneath it, like someone stepping into a room where the past might still be listening. "I suppose the town remembered me before I remembered how to return," she replied, her tone light but edged with something more fragile than she intended. Martha's eyes, observant without being intrusive, rested on Claire for a moment longer than necessary, as though searching for something not immediately visible, and then she nodded once, setting the figurine aside with a precision that bordered on ritual. "Ashwood has a way of keeping things," she said, almost to herself, "even when people think they've left them behind." Claire moved slowly through the shop, her fingers brushing against the edges of objects that seemed to hum faintly with stories. An old clock that no longer ticked yet still held the posture of time, a stack of letters bound with fading ribbon, a mirror whose surface reflected not just her face but something quieter behind it. "You must see a lot of things pass through here," Claire said, though the words felt insufficient, as if what she meant could not be fully contained in a question. Martha allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Things rarely pass," she replied. "They pause, they wait, and sometimes they decide whether they want to be remembered." Before Claire could respond, the bell above the door chimed again, and a man stepped inside, removing his hat with a familiarity that suggested long habit rather than conscious politeness. He paused when he saw Claire. Not abruptly, but just enough for the moment to register as something slightly out of alignment. "Morning, Martha," he said, his voice steady, though it carried an undercurrent that Claire could not quite place. "Arthur," Martha replied, inclining her head with a restraint that felt deliberate, almost rehearsed. Arthur moved further into the shop, his gaze flicking briefly toward Claire before settling on Martha again, and there was something in that glance, not curiosity exactly, but recognition complicated by something older. "Didn't expect to see anyone new in here," he said, though the words felt less like an observation and more like a question he chose not to ask directly. "She's not new," Martha answered, her tone unchanged. "Only returning." Arthur's eyes shifted again, studying Claire with a quiet attentiveness that made her feel, for a moment, as though she were being measured against a memory she did not fully understand. "People don't usually come back," he said almost thoughtfully. "Not for long." Claire considered this, her hand resting lightly on the edge of a wooden table whose surface bore the faint marks of time. "Maybe they don't," she said. "Or maybe they just don't stay long enough to see what's still here." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it carried weight, like a conversation that had chosen to remain beneath the surface rather than risk being spoken aloud. Arthur nodded once, as though acknowledging something unspoken, and then turned his attention to a set of tools displayed near the back, though his presence in the room seemed to linger in a way that suggested he was listening even when he appeared not to be. As Claire moved back toward the counter, her gaze fell on a small stack of envelopes partially tucked beneath a ledger, their edges yellowed, their corners softened by time, and something about them, something in their quiet persistence, drew her attention. "Do people ever leave things here intentionally?" she asked, her voice softer now, as if aware that the question might reach further than she intended. Martha's hand paused mid-motion. For a brief moment, the rhythm of the room shifted. "They do," she said finally, her voice carrying a weight that had not been there before. "Especially when they aren't sure what to do with what they feel." Claire hesitated, then spoke again, though the words came more carefully this time. "And do they ever come back for them?" Martha's gaze moved toward the envelopes, then back to Claire, and something unguarded flickered there before it was gently set aside. "Not always," she said, "and sometimes that changes more than they realize." Outside, the light dimmed slightly as clouds gathered more thickly overhead, softening the edges of the day and casting the street in a muted gray that felt less like an ending and more like a hesitation. Arthur set down the tool he had been examining, his movements quieter now, as though the air itself had shifted around him. "Storm might come early this year," he said, though his eyes were not on the window. Martha did not respond immediately. Instead, she reached beneath the counter and withdrew a single envelope, its paper more worn than the others, its edges uneven, as though it had been handled more often than it should have been. She did not open it. She did not offer it. She simply held it for a moment, her fingers resting along its surface with a familiarity that suggested something far deeper than habit. Claire watched, her breath catching slightly without understanding why. "What if," Martha said quietly, almost to the air between them, "silence doesn't protect what we think it does?" The bell above the door did not move, yet the room felt as though something had just entered, or perhaps something had been acknowledged that could no longer remain hidden. Claire left the shop not with answers, but with a growing sense that the town, in all its quiet preservation, was holding something that had waited far too long to remain undiscovered. And as the first faint hint of rain touched the pavement, barely visible yet unmistakable. One question lingered more persistently than the others. What if silence changed everything? By late afternoon, the clouds had lifted just enough to allow a softened sunlight to spill across Ashwood, casting everything in a muted gold that felt less like celebration and more like remembrance. And yet the town moved with a quiet energy as preparations for the autumn festival unfolded along Main Street. Claire arrived slowly, her steps unhurried as she took in the familiar yet altered landscape. Tables lined with handmade goods, lanterns strung between trees whose leaves flickered like small, restless flames, and the distant sound of laughter that seemed to rise and fall with the breeze rather than remain fixed in any one place. The air carried a blend of scents: fresh cider, baked bread, and the crispness of approaching cold. And beneath it all lingered that same underlying note of wood smoke that seemed to define Ashwood in ways no description ever fully could. She paused near the edge of the street, watching rather than entering, as though unsure whether she was part of the scene or simply passing through it. "You're standing like someone deciding whether to stay or leave," a voice said beside her, rough but not unkind. Claire turned to find Arthur, his hands tucked loosely into the pockets of his flannel jacket, his expression unreadable in a way that suggested it had learned over time to reveal only what was necessary. "Maybe I am," she replied, though the answer felt more honest than she had intended. Arthur nodded slightly, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. "Town doesn't mind either way," he said, glancing toward the gathering, "but it notices." They stood for a moment in shared silence, watching as a group of children ran past, their laughter trailing behind them like something briefly untethered from the weight of time. Claire exhaled slowly. "I used to come here every year," she said, her gaze fixed on the lantern swaying gently above the street, "and it always felt the same even when everything else changed." Arthur shifted his weight, the gravel beneath his boots giving a soft, grounding crunch. "Things don't stay the same," he said. "They just learn how to look like they do." Before Claire could respond, a familiar voice called out from across the street. "Claire!" Martha approached with measured steps, her cardigan moving slightly with the breeze, carrying with it that faint scent of lavender that seemed to follow her like a quiet signature. "You found your way here," she said, though there was something in her tone that suggested she had expected nothing less. Claire smiled faintly. "It seemed like the kind of place I wasn't meant to avoid," she replied. Martha inclined her head, her gaze shifting briefly toward Arthur, and in that small, nearly imperceptible exchange, something passed between them. Not hostility, not even discomfort exactly, but a recognition edged with something unresolved. "You've been busy," Arthur said, his tone neutral, though the words felt heavier than they sounded. "As have you," Martha replied, her voice steady, though her hands clasped together more tightly than before. The pause that followed was longer than the conversation required. Claire noticed it. More than noticed, it settled somewhere in her awareness as something that did not belong entirely to the present moment. "You two have known each other a long time," she said, the observation gentle, yet intentional enough to test the space between them. Arthur gave a small, humorless exhale. "Long enough," he said. Martha did not immediately respond. Instead, she looked toward the lanterns, their light beginning to glow more distinctly as the sun dipped lower, and when she spoke, her voice carried a softness that felt almost like distance. "Time has a way of arranging people," she said. "Sometimes closer, sometimes further apart than they expect." A breeze moved through the street, lifting leaves into brief, swirling patterns before letting them fall again. and the temperature seemed to drop just enough to remind everyone that evening was not something to delay. Music began somewhere near the center of the festival, soft, unintrusive, yet steady enough to draw people inward. Claire watched as the crowd shifted, small groups forming and dissolving with an ease that spoke of familiarity rather than effort. "You should go in," Martha said, her gaze returning to Claire. "It helps to remember how things feel." Claire hesitated. "And if they don't feel the same?" she asked. Martha's expression softened, though it did not quite become a smile. "Then you learn what has changed," she said. "And sometimes that matters more." Arthur looked between them, his eyes lingering for a moment longer on Martha, and something unspoken tightened in his posture before he turned slightly away. "I've got a few things to finish before it gets dark," he said, though it sounded less like necessity and more like retreat. Martha nodded, though her gaze did not follow him as he stepped back into the flow of the crowd. Claire watched him go, then turned back. "You avoid each other," she said quietly, not as an accusation but as a recognition. Martha's hand stilled. For a moment, the sounds of the festival seemed to recede, as though the town itself had chosen not to interrupt. "Some distances," Martha said slowly, "are not about space." Claire studied her, sensing that the answer, like so many in this place, existed just beneath what was being said. "And are they meant to stay that way?" she asked. Martha looked toward the far end of the street, where the light had begun to thin into evening gray, and her voice, when it came, carried something closer to weariness than certainty. "Sometimes they do," she said, "until something changes the balance." The first lantern flickered brighter as dusk settled more firmly over Ashwood, and the warmth of the festival began to contrast with the cool edge of the air, creating that peculiar tension between comfort and unease that often accompanies the end of something rather than its beginning. Claire stepped forward at last, allowing herself to be drawn into the gathering, though her thoughts remained anchored to the quiet space she had just left behind. Because whatever existed between Martha and Arthur was not finished. It was waiting. And as the wind shifted again, carrying with it a faint chill that hinted at something colder on its way, one question lingered with a quiet persistence. Why do they avoid each other? The morning unfolded beneath a low, unsettled sky that seemed undecided between holding its silence or breaking into rain, and the air carried a muted heaviness that pressed gently against the windows, as though the day itself were waiting for something to be revealed before it could fully begin. Claire sat at the kitchen table with the box placed carefully before her, its surface catching the faint gray light in a way that made its edges appear softer than they were. And yet the small lock remained unchanged, quiet, deliberate, and unwavering in its refusal to yield. She had turned it over in her hands more times than she cared to admit, tracing its corners, weighing its presence, as though familiarity alone might persuade it to open, but the box held its silence with a patience that felt almost human. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in uneven currents, lifting clusters of leaves and letting them fall again without direction, and the sound, though gentle, carried an undercurrent of restlessness that echoed something unsettled within her. It was not curiosity alone that kept her at the table. It was the sense that whatever lay inside had already shaped her life in ways she had not yet understood. A knock at the door broke the stillness, not abrupt but firm enough to insist upon itself. Claire rose slowly, her fingers brushing once more against the box before she stepped into the hallway, where the air felt slightly cooler, as though the house had shifted in anticipation. When she opened the door, Arthur stood on the porch, his posture steady against the wind, his flannel jacket carrying the faint scent of sawdust and cold air. "Figured that porch wasn't going to fix itself," he said, though his tone carried a quiet acknowledgement that his visit was not entirely about repairs. Claire stepped aside, allowing him in. "I suppose some things wait for the right moment," she replied, her voice lighter than she felt. Arthur nodded once, as though agreeing with something beyond the words themselves, and moved toward the front of the house, where the loose boards had begun to shift with each change in temperature. The sound of his work, measured hammering, the deliberate adjustment of wood against wood, filled the space in a way that was both grounding and strangely intimate, as though each strike carried with it a quiet insistence that things could still be set right, even when they were not entirely broken. Claire returned to the kitchen, though her attention remained divided, drawn repeatedly back to the box as if it had begun to exert a pull she could no longer ignore. After some time, Arthur stepped inside, brushing his hands together as though shedding the remnants of the work, and his gaze almost immediately found the table. The box. He did not ask about it. Not at first. Instead, he stood there for a moment, his eyes resting on it with a familiarity that felt unearned and yet undeniable. "Where did you find this?" he asked finally, his voice quieter than before, as though the question itself required a different kind of care. Claire hesitated, sensing the shift. "In my mother's room," she said, "locked away in a drawer that wasn't meant to be locked." Arthur stepped closer, his movements slower now, as though each step carried a weight he had not anticipated when he arrived. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked. The question was simple. The answer was not. And yet, Claire found herself nodding, as though something in his tone had already decided for her. Arthur reached out, his hands, steady, practiced, accustomed to shaping things, closing around the box with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with their roughness, and for a moment he simply held it, his thumbs tracing the edges in a way that suggested recognition rather than inspection. "This isn't just any lock," he said, more to himself than to Claire. "It's meant to keep something specific, not just anyone out." Claire leaned forward slightly, her breath catching in quiet anticipation. "Can you open it?" she asked. Arthur did not answer immediately. Instead, he set the box down, reached into his pocket, and withdrew a small set of tools, not elaborate, not specialized, but chosen with care. And as he worked, his movements were deliberate, patient, as though he understood that forcing the mechanism would only ensure it remained closed. The room seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the wind stilled. Even the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall seemed to soften, as though time itself had chosen to step aside. There was a soft click. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Arthur paused, his hand resting on the lid. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, his eyes lifting to meet Claire's, and in that moment, there was something almost protective in his expression, as though he understood the weight of what might follow. Claire held his gaze. "You can't outrun your own shadow," she said quietly, though the words felt less like a statement and more like a surrender. Arthur nodded once. Then he opened the box. Inside lay a collection of items arranged with a care that suggested intention rather than concealment. Photographs, their edges softened by time. A small stack of notebooks bound in faded fabric, and beneath them a bundle of letters tied together with a thin, worn ribbon. Claire reached for one of the photographs first. The image had faded, but not beyond recognition. A younger version of her mother stood beside two figures she did not immediately recognize, one of them unmistakably Arthur, though years had softened the lines of his face, and the other. Claire's breath caught. "Martha," she whispered. The realization settled slowly, like something long suspended finally finding its place. She looked up, her eyes searching Arthur's face for confirmation he did not immediately offer. "You knew her," Claire said, though the words felt insufficient, as though they barely touched the truth beneath them. Arthur exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting toward the window, where the first drops of rain had begun to fall, soft at first, then steadier, as though the sky had finally made its decision. "We all knew each other," he said, his voice carrying a weight that had not been there before. "Closer than most folks ever get." Claire's fingers moved to the notebooks, opening one carefully, her eyes scanning the pages filled with handwriting she recognized instantly as her mother's, though the words themselves felt distant, as though written for someone else entirely. "Why was this hidden from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Arthur did not answer. Not because he would not, but because in that moment, it was clear that the answer had been waiting far longer than either of them had been prepared to face. The rain continued through the night, steady and unbroken, its rhythm settling into the house like a quiet insistence that something long held back had finally been released. And by morning the world outside had shifted into a muted gray that softened every edge while deepening every shadow. Claire stood at the window, watching as water gathered along the branches before slipping free, each drop falling with a quiet inevitability that felt less like loss and more like continuation. And yet the weight of what she had discovered lingered within her, unresolved and pressing. The photographs, the letters, the notebooks, they lay spread across the table behind her, no longer contained, no longer silent. And yet they had not explained everything. Perhaps they were never meant to. A knock came again, though softer this time, as though shaped by the weather itself. When Claire opened the door, Arthur stood there, his hat damp from the rain, his expression more guarded than before, as if the act of returning required a different kind of strength than the one that had brought him there the day before. "I left before finishing," he said, though it sounded less like explanation and more like acknowledgement. Claire stepped aside. "You don't have to explain," she replied, though her voice carried a quiet understanding that suggested she knew he would anyway. Arthur entered, the scent of rain following him in, mingling with the lingering warmth of the kitchen in a way that felt almost like contrast made visible. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was not empty. It was filled with questions, with recognition, with the slow unfolding of something neither of them could yet name. Arthur moved toward the table, his gaze settling on the open pages, the scattered fragments of a past that had begun to surface whether it was invited or not. "She wrote everything down," he said finally, his voice low, almost reflective. "Always said if she didn't it would disappear." Claire turned slightly, her arms folding loosely as though to contain something that had not yet settled. "And did it?" she asked. Arthur considered this, his eyes tracing the lines of handwriting that had once belonged to a woman they both knew in entirely different ways. "No," he said. "It just waited." The rain intensified briefly, striking the windows with a sharper rhythm before easing again, as though testing the strength of what lay inside. Claire stepped closer. "You were there," she said, not as a question, but as a recognition that had already taken hold. Arthur's shoulders shifted, not in resistance, but in the subtle way of someone adjusting to a weight that had never fully left. "I was," he said. He pulled out a chair and sat, his movements slower now, as though each action required consideration, And when he looked up, there was something in his expression that had not been there before. Not openness exactly, but the absence of deflection. "There are things," he began, then paused, his gaze drifting toward the window where the rain blurred the world beyond into something indistinct, "that don't stay where you leave them." Claire remained still, allowing the silence that followed to stretch just long enough for it to become necessary rather than avoidable. "Was it the war?" she asked gently. Arthur's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice, when it came, remained steady. "The war doesn't end when you come home," he said. "It just changes where it lives." The words settled heavily between them. Claire moved to the chair across from him, her hands resting lightly on the table, close to but not touching the pages. "What happened?" she asked, her tone careful, as though aware that the question itself carried weight. Arthur leaned back slightly, his gaze unfocused for a moment, as if looking at something far beyond the room. "There are days," he said slowly, "when you remember everything too clearly. The sound, the heat, the way time stretches in the wrong direction. And then there are days when it all feels like it belongs to someone else." The rain softened again, its rhythm returning to something closer to a quiet persistence than insistence. "I came back," he continued, "but not all of me did, and the parts that stayed behind, they don't always know they're gone." Claire listened, not interrupting, not filling the spaces between his words, because it was clear that those spaces were where the truth lived. "And your mother," Arthur said, his voice shifting slightly. "She was one of the few who didn't pretend everything was fine." Claire's breath caught. "She knew?" she asked. Arthur nodded. "She knew enough," he said. "And sometimes that's more than people are ready for." He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against one of the letters, though he did not pick it up. "There are things we didn't say," he added, his voice quieter now. "Not because we didn't want to, but because we thought silence would protect what we still had." Claire felt the weight of those words settle into something deeper than understanding. "And did it?" she asked. Arthur looked at her then, fully, and whatever answer he might have given seemed to shift before it reached his lips. "No," he said simply. Outside, the rain began to ease, the clouds thinning just enough to allow a faint, uncertain light to emerge, and the world beyond the window appeared altered, not entirely changed, but no longer quite the same. Claire leaned back slightly, her gaze moving between Arthur and the pages before her, aware that what she had uncovered was not a single story, but a convergence of many, each incomplete on its own, yet undeniably connected. "Do some things ever come back?" she asked quietly, though the question felt larger than the moment that held it. Arthur followed her gaze to the window, where the last drops of rain fell with a quiet finality. "Some do," he said after a long pause, "but not the way you expect." And as the first break in the clouds allowed a thin strand of light to reach the ground, uncertain yet present, the question lingered, not as something to be answered immediately, but as something that would not easily fade. Do some things never return? The day unfolded beneath a sky that seemed suspended between seasons, where the last remnants of autumn clung stubbornly to the branches while a colder undercurrent moved quietly through the air, hinting at winter's inevitable arrival, and the light, thin, almost translucent, rested over Ashwood in a way that made every surface appear both present and fading at once. Claire walked slowly along Main Street, her steps measured not by destination but by thought, as though each movement required an adjustment to the shifting landscape within her, where fragments of her mother's past, now no longer distant or abstract, had begun to gather into something heavier, more insistent, and far less willing to remain unanswered. The town in its quiet persistence continued as it always had, doors opening, voices rising briefly before settling again, the distant hum of daily routines carrying on without interruption. Yet beneath it all, Claire sensed a subtle tension, as though something long held beneath the surface had begun to press upward, not violently, but with a steady, undeniable force. She found herself standing once more before the antique shop, its windows reflecting a muted version of the world behind her, and when she stepped inside, the familiar chime of the bell sounded softer than she remembered, as if the room itself had shifted in response to something unspoken. Martha stood behind the counter, though she was not polishing anything this time, her hands resting lightly on the surface as if she had paused mid-task and simply forgotten to continue. And when she looked up, her gaze met Claire's with a steadiness that suggested she had been expecting this moment, even if she had not known exactly when it would arrive. "You opened it," Martha said, her voice neither surprised nor entirely neutral, but shaped by a quiet recognition that carried more weight than the words themselves. Claire nodded, though the motion felt heavier than it should have. "I did," she replied, her voice careful, as though each word required consideration before it could be trusted to remain intact. Martha inclined her head slightly, her eyes searching Claire's face not for confirmation, but for something deeper, perhaps the beginning of a consequence she had long anticipated. "And now," Martha said slowly, "you know more than you did before." Claire let out a breath that had been waiting somewhere just beneath the surface. "Yes," she said, "but not enough to understand why none of it was ever told to me." The air in the shop seemed to shift, not dramatically, but enough to register as something that could no longer remain unchanged, and outside, a faint wind began to move again, lifting a few scattered leaves against the window before letting them fall back into place. Martha's fingers tightened slightly against the counter, though her posture remained composed. "Not everything that is known," she said, "is easy to carry once it is spoken." Claire stepped closer, her gaze unwavering now, not confrontational but steady in a way that suggested she had moved beyond hesitation into something quieter, yet far more resolute. "And is silence easier?" she asked, her voice low, though the question seemed to extend beyond the room itself, touching something older, something that had been waiting far too long to be asked aloud. Martha did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned slightly, her eyes moving toward a shelf near the back of the shop where a small wooden box, different from Claire's, yet similar in its quiet presence, rested among other objects that appeared ordinary until one chose to look more closely. "There are moments," Martha said at last, "when silence feels like protection, not for oneself but for others, and it becomes difficult to tell the difference between what we are preserving and what we are postponing." Claire followed her gaze, though her thoughts remained anchored to the words that had just been spoken, turning them over as though searching for something hidden within their shape. "My mother wrote everything down," Claire said, her voice softer now, "but she never gave it to me." Martha's expression shifted, not visibly enough to be called change, but enough to suggest that the mention of Claire's mother had touched something that could not be entirely concealed. "She believed," Martha said carefully, "that some truths arrive when they are ready, not when we are." Claire let out a quiet, almost incredulous breath. "And what if they arrive too late?" she asked. The question lingered between them, heavier now, shaped not by curiosity but by the weight of what had already been lost. Martha's gaze lowered briefly, her hands moving once more, not to polish, but to steady themselves against the counter as though grounding her in something present. "Then we learn," she said, her voice quieter than before, "what silence has cost." Outside, the sky darkened slightly, the thin light giving way to something more subdued, and the wind carried with it a sharper edge, a subtle shift that suggested the season was no longer content to linger between states. Claire studied Martha, sensing that the distance between them was no longer defined by unfamiliarity, but by something far more complex, a shared connection to a past that neither of them had fully chosen, yet both had inherited in different ways. "You knew her," Claire said, though the words felt insufficient, as though they barely touched the truth that hovered just beyond them. Martha nodded slowly. "I did," she replied. "And Arthur," Claire added, watching closely now. At the mention of Arthur, something in Martha's expression tightened, not visibly enough to be called resistance, but enough to suggest that his name carried a weight she had not yet decided how to bear. "Yes," Martha said, after a pause that stretched just long enough to be felt. "Arthur, too." Claire took another step forward, her voice steady despite the quiet tension that had begun to gather in the room. "Then whatever this is," she said, gesturing faintly as though to encompass not just the box but everything it represented, "it connects all of you." Martha closed her eyes briefly, as if acknowledging a truth that had long been present but carefully contained. "It does," she said. The simplicity of the answer made it heavier. Claire waited, though she no longer expected the rest to come easily. Martha opened her eyes again, her gaze returning to Claire with a quiet resolve that had not been there before, as though something within her had begun to shift. Not fully, not yet, but enough to suggest that the silence she had carried for so long was no longer as certain as it once had been. "There is something," Martha said slowly, "that I should have said a long time ago." Claire's breath caught slightly, though she did not speak. Martha's fingers moved once more, this time reaching toward a drawer beneath the counter, though she stopped before opening it, her hand hovering there as though held back by something not yet fully released. The wind outside rose again, stronger now, pressing lightly against the windows, and the first faint trace of colder air slipped into the room through a barely visible gap. Martha withdrew her hand. "Not yet. Some truths," she said, her voice steadier than before yet still carrying the weight of hesitation, "change more than the past." Claire held her gaze, understanding now that whatever lay ahead would not come all at once, but in pieces, each one requiring its own moment to be faced. And as the light continued to fade into a deeper gray, settling over Ashwood with a quiet inevitability, one question remained, not as something to be answered immediately, but as something that could no longer be avoided. Should she speak, or remain silent again? The storm arrived not with sudden force, but with a quiet certainty that seemed to gather itself over the course of the afternoon, as the sky deepened into a dense, unbroken gray and the air grew sharper with each passing hour, until the first snow began to fall, slow, deliberate, and unrelenting in its calm. By evening, Ashwood had been transformed. The roads, once lined with scattered leaves, were now softened beneath a growing layer of white. The familiar edges of the town blurred into something quieter, more contained, and the wind, though not violent, carried a steady persistence that made travel less a choice and more an inconvenience best avoided. The diner, however, remained open. It always did. Claire had not intended to go there, yet when the storm thickened and the house grew colder despite her efforts, she found herself drawn toward the one place in town where light gathered against the dark in a way that felt both practical and necessary. The bell above the diner door rang more sharply than usual as she stepped inside, the sudden warmth wrapping around her with an immediacy that felt almost disorienting after the cold. The scent of coffee, rich, familiar, grounding, filled the air, accompanied by the low murmur of voices that had settled into a steady rhythm, as though the storm had gathered not just snow but people. Several townsfolk sat at scattered tables, their coats draped over chairs, their conversation subdued yet continuous, and behind the counter, the quiet efficiency of the place carried on as it always had, unbothered by the weather beyond its walls. Claire paused just inside the door, brushing the snow from her sleeves, her breath still catching slightly from the cold. "You picked a good night to come in," a voice said from one of the booths, rough yet familiar. She turned. Arthur sat near the window, a cup of coffee before him, its surface sending up thin strands of steam that twisted briefly before disappearing into the warmth of the room. "Didn't feel like staying alone," Claire admitted, moving toward him, her steps slow as though adjusting to the shift between cold and warmth. Arthur nodded, as if the answer required no further explanation. "Storm has a way of doing that," he said. "Brings people together whether they planned on it or not." Claire slid into the seat across from him, the vinyl cool at first before gradually warming beneath her. Outside, the snow continued to fall, thicker now, the flakes catching in the light of the street lamp and turning the world beyond the window into something almost indistinct. For a while, neither of them spoke. The sound of cups being set down, the low hum of conversation, the occasional creak of the building adjusting to the cold, all of it filled the space between them in a way that felt neither forced nor empty. Then the bell above the door rang again. Claire glanced up. Martha stepped inside, her coat dusted with snow, her movements careful yet steady as she closed the door behind her, sealing the warmth of the diner against the storm outside. For a brief moment, her gaze moved across the room, and then settled on Claire and Arthur. Something in her expression shifted. Not surprise. Not entirely. But recognition layered with something more difficult to name. "Well," Arthur said quietly, almost to himself, "looks like the storm's decided for us." Martha approached slowly, her steps measured, and when she reached the table, she hesitated just long enough for the moment to be felt before taking the seat beside Claire. "I didn't expect to see you both here," she said, though the words carried a softness that suggested she had, perhaps, expected something like this all along. Claire wrapped her hands around her cup, drawing warmth from it as much as from the presence now surrounding her. "Seems the town had other plans," she said. Martha nodded slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window where the snow had begun to accumulate along the edges, softening the view until the outside world appeared distant, almost unreachable. "Storms do that," she said, her voice quieter now. "They close things off and open others." Arthur shifted in his seat, his eyes moving briefly toward Martha before returning to the table, as though the act of looking directly carried more weight than he was prepared to hold. "Depends on what you're willing to face," he said. The words lingered. Claire felt it then, not just the presence of the storm, but the way it had gathered them here, contained them within a space where leaving was no longer simple, where silence, if it remained, would become something heavier than speech. She looked between them. "There's something I need to understand," she said, her voice steady despite the quiet tension that had begun to form. Martha's hands tightened slightly around her cup. Arthur exhaled slowly. Neither interrupted. Claire continued. "The box," she said. "The letters, the photographs, all of it connects you." The storm outside intensified, the wind rising just enough to press faintly against the windows, as though listening. Martha's gaze lowered, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened glass beyond. "Yes," she said. Arthur's jaw tightened, though he did not speak. Claire leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now, yet more certain. "Then why was it hidden from me?" The question settled over the table, heavier than any of the others that had come before, shaped not just by curiosity but by something deeper, something that had begun to take form the moment the box was opened. Martha closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering something long held in place. Arthur looked toward her, his expression unreadable yet unmistakably attentive. Outside, the snow fell harder, the world beyond the diner fading further into white. Inside, the warmth held but just barely. Martha opened her eyes, and in that moment something shifted. Not loudly, not completely, but enough. "What happens?" she said slowly, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to rise from somewhere far beneath the surface. "When the truth finally asks to be heard?" The question remained unanswered, but no longer unspoken. The storm pressed itself more firmly against the windows of the diner, its steady insistence turning the outside world into a shifting veil of white and gray, where outlines dissolved and distances lost their meaning, and inside, the warmth seemed to gather more tightly around those who remained, as though the building itself understood that what was about to unfold required shelter not just from the cold, but from something far more enduring. At the small table near the window, the air had changed, not in temperature but in weight, and Claire sat very still, her hands wrapped around her cup long after the coffee had begun to cool, while across from her Arthur leaned back slightly, his posture composed yet carrying a tension that revealed itself only in the subtle tightening of his jaw. Beside Claire, Martha did not move immediately after speaking, her gaze resting somewhere between the reflection in the glass and the storm beyond it, as though she were measuring not the distance outside, but the one she had maintained within herself for far too many years. "When you hold something long enough," Martha began, her voice low and deliberate, each word shaped with a care that suggested it had been waiting for this exact moment. "It stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like part of who you are." The sounds of the diner softened around them, not because they had ceased, but because they had receded into the background, allowing the space at the table to become something more contained, more focused, as though time itself had chosen to narrow its attention. Claire did not interrupt. She understood instinctively that this was not something to be rushed, and that whatever Martha was about to say would not come easily, nor all at once. Martha's hand shifted slightly, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup as though grounding herself in something tangible before continuing. "Your mother," she said, her gaze lowering briefly before returning to Claire, "was the kind of person who saw things as they were, even when the rest of us preferred not to." Claire felt something tighten in her chest, though she remained still, her attention unwavering. "She believed," Martha continued, "that truth, no matter how difficult, was the only thing that could eventually set things right, and I believed something different." Arthur exhaled quietly, his eyes moving toward the table, though he said nothing. "There was a time," Martha went on, "when the three of us were not separate pieces of a story, but part of the same one, before choices began to divide what had once felt certain." The storm outside intensified briefly, the wind pressing harder against the glass, as though echoing the shift in her voice. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. "What choices?" she asked, her voice steady, though it carried an edge that had not been there before. Martha closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, something in her expression had changed. Not softened, not hardened, but clarified, as though she had finally decided to stop holding back what could no longer remain contained. Arthur came back from the war, she said, her voice quieter now yet more certain. And not everything came back with him. Arthur's gaze lifted briefly, then lowered again, the movement small but unmistakable. Your mother stayed, Martha continued, when others might have stepped away, and she carried more than anyone should have been asked to, because she believed that love meant remaining, even when things became difficult to understand. Claire felt the words settle into her, each one finding a place she had not realized was waiting. And you? She asked. The question was simple. The answer was not. Martha's hand stilled. I chose silence, she said. The admission lingered, heavier than anything that had come before it. Not because I didn't see what was happening, she added, her voice tightening slightly, but because I convinced myself that speaking would only make things worse, that it would break what little remained intact. Arthur shifted again, his fingers curling loosely against the edge of the table, though he still did not speak. There was a night, Martha said, her gaze distant now, as though looking not at the present but through it, when everything could have been said, when the truth stood right there between us waiting, and I let it pass. Claire's breath caught, though she did not yet understand why. What happened? She asked, her voice softer now. Martha hesitated, and for a moment it seemed as though she might stop there, as though the weight of what remained was still too much to release. But the storm outside did not relent, and neither did the moment. Your mother was leaving, Martha said at last. Not forever, but long enough to change things, and she asked me to tell you something if anything ever happened to her. Claire's heart stilled just for a moment. And you didn't, she said. It was not a question. Martha shook her head slowly. I didn't, she replied. The simplicity of it made it heavier. Because I thought, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper now, that if I kept it hidden, I could preserve what was left of her for you. Not the complications, not the uncertainty, but the version of her that felt complete. Claire stared at her, the weight of those words settling into something sharper, more difficult to hold. But that wasn't the truth, she said. No, Martha answered, her gaze steady despite the quiet fracture in her voice. It wasn't. The storm outside began to ease slightly, the wind softening just enough to allow the falling snow to settle more gently against the ground, though the world beyond the window remained obscured. Claire leaned back slowly, her hands no longer gripping the cup, but resting loosely in her lap as though she no longer needed to anchor herself to anything outside what she was beginning to understand. What did she want you to tell me? She asked, her voice quieter now, though no less certain. Martha's lips parted slightly, then closed again, as though the final piece of the truth required more than words alone to be released. Arthur looked up then, his gaze moving between them, something unreadable passing through his expression. And in that suspended moment, where the storm had not yet fully passed and the silence had not yet been broken, the question remained, not as something abstract, but as something immediate, something real. Can something unforgivable be understood? By morning, the storm had moved on, leaving behind a landscape transformed not by destruction, but by quiet accumulation, where every surface was softened beneath a layer of snow that reflected the pale winter light in a way that made the world feel both brighter and more distant, as though everything had been gently set apart from itself. Claire walked back to the house alone, her steps measured yet uneven beneath the fresh snow, each movement accompanied by the soft, muffled sound of her boots pressing into the ground, and the air cold, sharp, and unmistakably clear, seemed to strip away any remaining hesitation, leaving only the raw edges of what she had begun to understand. The house greeted her not with warmth, but with a stillness that felt heavier than before, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what had been spoken and were now holding it in place. Inside, the quiet was absolute. No wind, no distant voices. Only the faint creak of the floor beneath her steps as she moved toward the kitchen, where the letters and photographs still lay scattered across the table, unchanged in their arrangement, yet entirely altered in their meaning. She stood there for a long moment looking at them, not as objects but as evidence, as fragments of something that no longer felt distant enough to be examined without consequence. "You should have told me," she said aloud, though there was no one there to hear it. The words settled into the room, unanswered. Claire reached for one of the notebooks, her fingers brushing against the worn fabric of its cover before opening it again, her eyes moving quickly across the pages as though searching for something that might contradict what she had heard, something that might restore the version of her mother she had always believed in. But the words did not change. They remained, and with them the quiet certainty that the truth, once uncovered, did not return easily to where it had been. Her hand tightened slightly on the edge of the table. "No," she murmured, shaking her head as though the motion itself might undo what had already taken hold. "That's not how it was." The denial came not from ignorance but from something deeper, the instinctive resistance to a truth that demanded too much rearrangement, too much reconsideration of what had once felt fixed. She moved away from the table, pacing slowly across the room, her steps uneven now, her thoughts shifting too quickly to settle. "My parents," she began, then stopped, the words catching as though they had encountered something they could not pass through. Who were they, really? The question rose unbidden, sharp and immediate, refusing to be set aside. Claire pressed her hand against the back of a chair, steadying herself as the weight of it settled more fully. "They loved each other," she said, her voice firmer now, as though asserting it might make it true in the way she needed it to be. And perhaps they had. But not simply. Not cleanly. Not in the way she had always imagined. The light outside shifted slightly, the pale sun breaking through the thinning clouds just enough to cast long, quiet shadows across the snow, and the brightness, instead of comforting, seemed to expose more than it concealed. Claire turned toward the window, her reflection faint against the white expanse beyond. "You don't just leave things like that," she said, her voice rising slightly now, though it carried more hurt than anger. "You don't decide what someone else deserves to know." The room offered no answer, only silence. And in that silence the truth remained, unchanged, unyielding, waiting not to be proven but to be accepted. Claire closed her eyes briefly, drawing in a slow breath that did little to steady the movement within her. When she opened them again, her gaze returned to the table, to the letters, to the photographs, to the story that had been kept from her, not by accident but by choice. Her choice. No, Martha's, Arthur's, her mother's. The realization did not bring clarity. It brought fracture. "You don't get to decide that," she said again, more quietly now, though the words carried a deeper weight, as though they had finally reached the place they were meant to land. Outside, a faint wind began to move once more, lifting a thin layer of snow into the air before letting it settle again, as though the landscape itself were adjusting to the change. Claire remained where she was, her reflection still faint in the glass, her expression no longer searching, but unsettled in a way that suggested the beginning of something she could not yet name. And as the light continued to shift, revealing more than it concealed. One question emerged. Not softly, not gently, but with a quiet insistence that would not easily fade. Who were my parents really? Morning did not arrive so much as it revealed itself gradually, as though the world, having been reshaped by the storm, required a gentler unveiling, and the light that filtered through the windows of Claire's house carried with it a subdued clarity, soft yet unmistakable, illuminating not only the surfaces it touched but also the quiet aftermath left in the wake of what had been uncovered. The snow lay undisturbed across the yard, its surface smooth and unbroken, giving the illusion of stillness, though beneath it the ground remained what it had always been, layered, uneven, holding traces of everything that had come before. And Claire stood at the window for a long time, her gaze resting not on the beauty of it, but on the way it concealed and revealed at once. Inside, the house no longer felt merely empty. Felt aware. As though the truths brought into it the night before had settled into its walls, not loudly, not disruptively, but with a quiet permanence that could not be undone by silence. Claire moved slowly through the kitchen, her hand brushing lightly against the table where the letters and photographs still lay, though now they seemed less like intrusions and more like pieces waiting to be understood, and she paused there, not to search them again, but to acknowledge their presence as something she could no longer ignore. There was no immediate resolution waiting for her. No single realization that could gather everything into something clean and complete. Instead, there was a shift subtle yet undeniable, in the way she held the questions themselves. Outside, the light strengthened slightly as the clouds continued to thin, and a faint warmth, barely perceptible yet present, touched the edges of the snow, beginning the slow, almost imperceptible process of change. Claire stepped outside, the cold air meeting her with a clarity that felt less harsh than before, and as she moved along the path, her footsteps left visible impressions behind her, each one marking a passage that could not be retraced without acknowledgement. She walked without direction at first, allowing the quiet of the town to settle around her, until she found herself once again near Main Street, where the signs of life had begun to return, doors opening cautiously, voices carrying softly across the distance, as though Ashwood itself were adjusting to what had passed. She did not enter the diner. Not yet. Instead, she continued toward the edge of town, where the houses grew fewer and the trees closer together, their branches still heavy with snow, their outlines softened but not erased. It was there that she saw him. Arthur stood near the frame of a structure not yet complete, his hands moving slowly as he adjusted a beam that did not seem to require fixing, and for a moment Claire simply watched, recognizing in his movements the same quiet insistence she had seen before, the need to mend even when nothing was visibly broken. "You always work after a storm," she called, her voice carrying across the still air with a steadiness she had not expected from herself. Arthur looked up, his expression unreadable at first, then softened slightly in recognition. "Storm leaves things out of place," he said, "whether they need fixing or not." Claire approached, her steps careful on the packed snow, her gaze moving briefly over the structure before returning to him. "And does it help?" she asked. Arthur considered this, his hands resting now at his sides, as though the question required more than a simple answer. "Sometimes," he said after a pause, "it just gives you something to do while you figure out what can't be fixed the same way." Claire nodded, the words settling into her with a quiet familiarity. "I keep thinking," she said slowly, "that if I go back through it all again, read everything more carefully, I might find something that makes it simpler." Arthur let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, but something close to it. Simple's not usually what you get, he said, just clearer. The distinction lingered. Claire looked out toward the trees, where a faint drip had begun as the snow responded to the subtle shift in temperature, each drop falling with a quiet persistence that suggested change not as an event, but as a process. I was angry, she said, her voice softer now though no less certain. And maybe I still am. Arthur nodded. That tends to come with truth, he said. Claire turned back to him. And does it go away? She asked. Arthur's gaze moved past her for a moment, as though measuring something not visible in the present. It changes, he said, like everything else. The air between them settled into a quieter space, not empty but less strained, as though something that had been tightly held had begun, however slightly, to loosen. Claire drew in a slow breath, the cold air steadying in its clarity. I don't know what comes next, she admitted. Arthur met her gaze, his expression steady, grounded in a way that felt less like certainty and more like acceptance. You don't have to, he said, not all at once. The simplicity of it made it easier to hold. Claire nodded, though the motion felt less like agreement and more like acknowledgement. Behind them, the town continued its quiet return to itself, the sounds of life gradually re-emerging, not in defiance of what had passed, but alongside it. And as the light strengthened just enough to cast longer shadows across the snow, revealing the shapes beneath what had once been hidden, one thought remained, not as a conclusion but as a beginning. Is truth an ending, or a beginning? The afternoon carried with it a gentler warmth than the day before, though winter had not yet loosened its hold entirely, and the light, pale but steady, stretched across Ashwood in a way that suggested not an arrival, but the quiet promise of one, as though the season itself were considering the possibility of change without fully committing to it. Claire found herself returning to the edge of town once more, not by coincidence but by something quieter and more deliberate, as though the conversation she had begun with Arthur had not yet reached its natural end, and the space between what had been said and what remained carried a weight she was no longer willing to leave unaddressed. Arthur was there again, though this time he was not working. Instead, he stood near the unfinished structure, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze directed outward toward the line of trees where the snow had begun, ever so slightly, to recede. You came back, he said without turning, his voice carrying a quiet recognition rather than surprise. Claire stepped closer, the sound of her footsteps softened by the dampening ground beneath them. So did you, she replied. Arthur allowed himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Habit, he said. Claire stood beside him, not too close, yet not distant enough to feel separate, and for a moment they simply shared the quiet, the kind that no longer required filling. I've been thinking, Claire said at last, her voice measured as though each word had been considered before being spoken, about what you said, about things not staying where you leave them. Arthur nodded slightly, though he did not yet respond. And about what my mother carried, she continued, her gaze moving toward the horizon where the light met the fading snow, and what you carried with her. The words settled gently without accusation, yet not without meaning. Arthur exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air, though less sharply than it had been the day before. She saw me, he said after a long pause. Not just the parts one was willing to show. Claire listened, her attention steady, her presence no longer tentative but quietly engaged. And what did you see? She asked. Arthur's gaze shifted, not away but inward. as though the question required him to look somewhere he had not visited in some time. Someone who didn't turn away, he said, even when it would have been easier. Claire felt something in that settle into place, not as a revelation, but as a recognition of something she had begun to understand. "And Martha?" she asked, the name spoken gently, yet with an awareness of the space it occupied between them. Arthur's expression changed slightly, not closed but more deliberate, as though the answer required a different kind of care. "Martha," he said slowly, "believed she was protecting what mattered by keeping certain things unsaid." Claire nodded, the echo of that belief familiar now, though no less complicated. "And were they?" she asked. Arthur considered this, his gaze returning to the structure beside them, its unfinished lines standing in quiet contrast to the certainty of the landscape around it. "For a while," he said, "it felt that way." Claire looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "And now?" she asked. Arthur let out a slow breath, the sound carrying a weight that suggested something long held had begun, at last, to shift. "Now it feels like distance," he said. "The kind you don't always notice until you try to cross it." The words lingered between them, not heavy, but present in a way that could not be ignored. Claire stepped slightly closer, her gaze moving from him to the unfinished structure and back again. "Is that what this is?" she asked, gesturing faintly toward it. "Something you're trying to cross?" Arthur followed her gesture, his expression softening just enough to suggest that the question had found its mark. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's just a reminder that some things take time to build again." Claire let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, but something lighter than what had come before. "I'm starting to think everything does," she said. Arthur glanced at her then, his gaze steady, and for the first time there was something in it that resembled not just recognition but connection. "It's not too late," he said. The words were simple, but they carried more than their shape suggested. Claire held his gaze, the meaning settling into her not as certainty, but as possibility. "For what?" she asked. Arthur did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked out toward the horizon once more, where the light had begun to shift, warming slightly as the afternoon moved toward evening. "For beginning again," he said. The phrase settled between them not as a conclusion but as an opening, something that did not erase what had come before, but allowed for the possibility that it did not have to define everything that followed. Claire felt it then, not resolution, not clarity, but something quieter and perhaps more important. A willingness. And as the light stretched a little further across the melting snow, softening its edges and revealing the ground beneath, one question remained, not as doubt but as a quiet invitation. Is it too late to begin again? The day carried a fragile brightness that seemed almost hesitant, as though the light itself was unsure whether it was ready to settle fully into the space the storm had left behind, and the air, still cool, yet softened at its edges, moved through Ashwood with a quiet steadiness that suggested not resolution, but the possibility of it. Claire stood for a long moment outside the antique shop, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe, feeling the faint vibration of the bell within before she even pushed it open, as though the building, like everything else in this town, had begun to recognize her presence not as something temporary, but as something returning. Inside, Martha stood near the window, her hands resting on the edge of a table as though she had paused in the middle of something and had not yet found the will to continue. And when she turned, her expression held no surprise, only a quiet acknowledgement that felt less like expectation and more like inevitability. "You came," Martha said, her voice low and measured, though there was something beneath it, something less guarded than before. Claire stepped inside, the bell sounding softly behind her, its tone lingering in the air like a note that refused to resolve. I almost didn't, Claire admitted, her gaze steady, though her fingers tightened slightly at her sides as if holding onto something that might otherwise slip away. Martha nodded once, as though she understood that hesitation more deeply than she might allow herself to show. That's often how it begins, she said. Claire moved further into the room, her eyes briefly tracing the familiar objects before returning to Martha, aware now that the space between them was no longer defined by distance alone, but by everything that had been said, and everything that had not. I've been thinking, Claire began, her voice careful though not uncertain, about what you chose to keep from me. Martha's hand shifted slightly, her fingers interlacing as though to steady themselves. And what have you found? She asked. Claire let out a slow breath, her gaze lowering for just a moment before lifting again. That it wasn't just about me, she said, and that doesn't make it easier. The honesty of it settled between them without resistance. No, Martha said quietly, it wouldn't. Silence followed, not empty but deliberate, as though both of them understood that what mattered now was not the absence of words, but the weight they carried when spoken. Claire took another step forward. You thought you were protecting something, she said, her tone neither accusing nor forgiving, but searching for something that could hold both at once. Martha's expression softened, though it did not become lighter. I did, she replied. And were you? Claire asked. The question lingered longer than the others had, not because it demanded an answer, but because it required one that could not be shaped into something easier than it was. Martha looked toward the window, where the light had begun to shift again, casting longer shadows across the floor, and when she spoke, her voice carried something closer to acceptance than certainty. I was protecting the version of the past I thought you deserved, she said, not the one that was true. Claire absorbed this, the distinction settling into place with a quiet clarity that did not remove the pain, but gave it shape. And now? She asked. Martha turned back to her, her gaze steady, though there was something in it that had changed, something less anchored in defense and more open to what might follow. Now I see that silence didn't preserve anything, she said. It only delayed what needed to be understood. Claire nodded slowly, her breath steadying as though something within her had begun, at last, to align. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said, the words spoken plainly without harshness, yet without softness either. Martha inclined her head, accepting the uncertainty without resistance. You don't have to, she replied. The simplicity of it carried more weight than reassurance ever could. Claire looked at her, really looked this time, not as the keeper of a secret, but as someone who had carried one for so long that it had become indistinguishable from who she was. But I don't think I can carry this the way it is, Claire continued, her voice quieter now though steadier than before. Martha's hands loosened slightly, as though something within her had been waiting for those words. Then perhaps, she said gently, you don't have to carry it alone. The shift was small, but unmistakable. Claire felt it, not as forgiveness, not yet, but as the first movement toward something that might one day become it. And as the light settled into the room with a quiet warmth that had not been there before, the question that remained was no longer sharp, no longer insistent, but something softer, something that allowed space for more than one answer. Is forgiveness a choice or a necessity? The change came slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, as the rigid edges of winter softened beneath a series of warmer days, and the snow, once firm and unyielding, began to recede in uneven patches, revealing the earth beneath in a way that felt less like disappearance and more like return. Ashwood shifted with the season, though not all at once, and the familiar streets, now lined with damp earth and the first hesitant signs of green, carried a different kind of energy, quieter than celebration, yet fuller than before, as though the town itself had taken a breath it had been holding for longer than anyone realized. Claire stood on the porch of the house, her hands resting lightly against the railing that Arthur had repaired, the wood now firm beneath her touch, its presence both practical and symbolic in a way she had come to understand without needing to name. The air smelled different, less sharp, more open. And somewhere nearby, the faint sound of water moving, melting snow finding its way back into the ground, carried a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. "You're getting used to it," Arthur said, his voice coming from just behind her, steady as always, though now carrying a warmth that had not been there before. Claire turned slightly, a small smile forming without effort. "I think I am," she said. Arthur stepped beside her, his gaze moving out toward the yard where the first small patches of green had begun to appear. "Town grows on you," he said, "whether you plan for it or not." Claire let out a quiet breath, her shoulders easing in a way that felt less like release and more like settling. "I used to think home was something you left behind," she said. "Something fixed in time that didn't change unless you did." Arthur glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "And now?" he asked. Claire considered this, her gaze drifting toward the horizon where the light had taken on a warmer tone, stretching longer into the evening. "Now I think it might be something you build," she said, "even if you don't realize you're doing it." Arthur nodded, the motion slow, deliberate. "That sounds about right," he said. They stood there in companionable silence, the kind that no longer required explanation, and the town in its quiet renewal seemed to mirror something within Claire that had begun, finally, to take shape. "I'm not leaving," she said after a while, her voice calm, though the decision carried more weight than its simplicity suggested. Arthur did not react immediately. Instead, he looked out toward the road, then back at her, as though measuring the distance between what had been and what now was. "Good," he said. The word was simple, but it held. Claire smiled, not broadly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt genuine, unforced. And as the light continued to soften into the early evening, carrying with it the quiet promise of what was still to come, one question lingered, not as uncertainty, but as something newly understood. Is home a place or something we build? Spring settled more fully over Ashwood, not in a single moment, but in a series of quiet transformations, the steady greening of trees, the return of familiar sounds long absent, the way the light lingered just a little longer each evening as though reluctant to leave, and with it came a sense not of conclusion but of continuation. The house, once heavy with absence, now carried a different kind of presence, still layered with memory, still shaped by what had been uncovered, but no longer defined solely by it. And Claire moved through its rooms with a familiarity that had grown not from the past alone, but from the life she had begun to rebuild within it. The letters remained. The photographs remained. But they no longer felt like interruptions. They felt like part of a story she was finally willing to understand in its entirety. On a quiet afternoon, when the air carried the faint scent of blooming trees and the light fell gently across the wooden floors, Claire stood in the backyard with Martha, the distance between them no longer marked by avoidance, but by something more tentative yet real. Neither of them spoke at first. They did not need to. The silence, once heavy, had softened into something that allowed space rather than taking it. Martha held the letter in her hands, the one she had never sent, the one she had carried for 40 years as both burden and shield, and her fingers traced its edges with a familiarity that spoke of time not just past but endured. "I thought," she said slowly, her voice quieter than Claire had ever heard it, "that holding on to it meant I hadn't lost the chance to say what needed to be said." Claire watched her, her gaze steady though gentle. "And now?" she asked. Martha looked down at the letter, then back up, her expression no longer guarded, but open in a way that felt both fragile and certain. "Now I see that the chance was never in the holding," she said. It was in the saying. The words settled into the space between them, not heavy, not light, but clear. Claire nodded, understanding not because everything had been resolved, but because something had shifted enough to allow for what came next. Martha took a slow breath. Then, with a steadiness that had taken years to find, she struck a match. The flame was small, unassuming, yet as it touched the edge of the paper, it carried with it a quiet finality that did not erase the past, but released it from the form it had been held in for so long. They watched as the letter burned, its edges curling inward, its words, once withheld, dissolving into something that could no longer be read, yet no longer needed to be. The smoke rose gently, carried upward by the soft spring air, until it disappeared into the open sky. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to, because what had remained unspoken for so long had, in its own way, finally been acknowledged. Claire felt it then, not as relief, not entirely, but as a quiet lightness that had not been there before, as though something within her had been given room to move where before it had been held in place. "Stories don't end the way we expect them to," she said after a while, her voice thoughtful though steady. Martha allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "No," she replied, "but sometimes they begin again when we least expect it." Claire looked out toward the yard, where the first true signs of spring had taken hold, where new growth emerged not in spite of what had come before, but because of it. And in that moment, the question that had lingered beneath everything, from the first step back into Ashwood to the quiet burning of a letter long unsent, rose once more, not as something unresolved, but as something finally understood. If truth frees us, why do we fear it so long?